Time for a big one then. Let's see what the powers of a Primarch can do on the table. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where we've been talking about the tactics for our Imperial armies to purge the forces of the Xenos and Chaos everywhere. In this video we'll be taking a look at Roboute Guilliman himself, the Lord Commander of the Imperium. We'll take a look at his datasheet and rules, any obvious synergies on the table, and how I'd use him in a game of 40k. Now, the return of Guilliman to the fray has been one of the biggest narrative developments in all of 40k history. Not so long ago, Primarchs were just legendary characters long dead and gone, with the occasional demon Primarch showing up once in a while to wreak havoc. With the restoration of Guilliman by the Inari, and the advent of the Primaris Marines, things may have begun to look up for the first time in a long time in the history of 40k. This is the very guy who wrote the Codex Astartes that all of the Space Marine legions more or less adhered to limit the power of any one legion to turn against the Imperium, and it's very interesting to have such a legendary figure return to the forefront of battle. So what can this guy do on the table for us then? Let's take a look. So Roboute Guilliman's datasheet was changed quite significantly in the new Ultramarines Codex. Prior to this, he was pretty much the centre buffing piece of a lot of competitive Space Marine lists, largely because of his very hard to balance full rerolls to hits and wounds that he could give. It basically made all the Space Marine units near him massively more valuable, and anything not in his bubble of buffing to be a little bit lacklustre. He's had some significant changes with the new Codex though, so let's take a look. Firstly, his points cost dropped from 400 to 350, which is a pretty sizable decrease just by itself. He has the same stat line as previously, movement 8, weapon skill and ballistic skill 2 up, strength and toughness of 6, 9 wounds, 6 attacks, leadership 10 and a 2 up save. And because he wears the armour of fate, he also has a 3 up invul save too. So Roboute has a ridiculously impressive stat line. It's about as much goodness as you can cram into under 10 wounds, which is very important as it means that you can't directly shoot him unless he's the closest unit. Strength and toughness 6 with a 3 up invul and a 2 up regular armour save is really hard to shift as well. He is armed with the Emperor's Sword and the Hand of Dominion. The Emperor's Sword gives him +2 strength, so strength 8, AP -4 and 3 damage. So he pretty well hits as hard as a multi-melter with this. In addition, every time you roll a 6 to wound, he inflicts D3 mortal wounds as well, in addition to all of his other damage, as he's typically going to be hitting with all of his 6 attacks. Due to a 2 up weapon skill and reroll 1s, you're pretty much likely to get around 1 6 to wound each combat phase, though obviously you could get much more or none. So on average you're going to get an additional D3 mortal wounds in addition to all of that nasty damage. The Hand of Dominion is a little bit changed from its previous incarnation. It'll give him strength ×2, AP -3 and a flat 4 damage, so this is very much the go-to against heavy armour now. On average against a toughness 7 or 8 vehicle, this will do on average 17.6 wounds, so easily enough to wreck most tanks. And of course he does have the option of fighting twice. That is of course assuming shock assault for the additional attack. With the Emperor's Sword, it will slightly outcompete the Hand of Dominion against your standard toughness 7 3 up save vehicle, but won't be as good against toughness 8 vehicles, due to needing to wound on a 4+. The sword's also better when fighting infantry for the most part. Presuming you're wounding on 2s with either weapon, then those mortal wounds and extra AP is more valuable than a flat 4 damage, which of course is massive overkill on any infantry models. The Hand of Dominion also has a shooting attack. It's a 24-inch rapid fire 3, strength 6, AP -1, damage 2 weapon, so it's decently dangerous against a lot of lighter targets, and can be particularly nasty when you're chewing up 2 wound infantry such as Primaris Marines. This one will be very nice with the Ultramarines' unique doctrine, being able to move his 8 inches and then still blast away with that at 24 inches, firing the full 6 shots. It's going to strim quite a lot of wounds from an infantry squad each turn. Let's look at his special rules now, and of course the Lord Commander of the Imperium has a lot. Firstly, we have Angels of Death, which will give him the all-important shock assault, so 7 attacks in the first round of combat. Combat Doctrines, which will get a lot out of the Ultramarine specific tactical doctrine, making that Hand of Dominion shooting AP -2, and able to move and shoot as we mentioned earlier. We briefly mentioned his Armour of Fate, giving him a 3 up invul save, which makes it very hard for you to remove him, whether you fire heavy anti-tank firepower at him or smaller lighter shots. But he also retains his ability to get back up when he is slain for the first time. When he's destroyed for the first time, you roll a dice, and on a 4+ he gets back up at the end of the phase with d6 wounds remaining. So with a couple of good rolls after your opponent has invested a lot to kill him the first time, he might well just stand back up, ready to go for another turn. If you are thinking that Guilliman is exposed enough to die in any given turn, then it's well worth saving a command reroll for this. It's a really enormous swing whether you keep such a powerful model on the table, or if he dies and does not access this rule. He has the Author of the Codex special rule, which means if your army is battle-forged and he is your warlord, you just gain an extra 3 command points. Now this is no small benefit. Many of the command point farming type warlord traits aren't necessarily going to acquire you many more command points than this in the first place, and an extra 3 will certainly give you a lot more options with all of the fancy new stratagems that Space Marines have to play with. His warlord trait is Nobility Made Manifest, which allows friendly units within 6 inches to heroically intervene as if they were characters. This could be quite nasty if he's advancing up the board with some aggressors or intercessors, and it could certainly catch your opponent out. I wouldn't say it's the strongest warlord trait in the world, but when you have 3 command points on top of it, it becomes a very strong combo indeed. Next we come on to his command abilities, so we have Master of Battle, which allows you to add 1 to advance and charge made for all friendly Imperium units while they're within 12 inches of him. Furthermore, Imperium units within 12 can also reroll hit rolls of 1, so he essentially acts as a captain for all Imperium units within that massive aura range. And finally, you can reroll morale tests for any Imperium units within 12 inches too. So that's a decent little swing of benefits. Reroll 1s isn't a bad buff at all, but it is unlikely to be worth buying in a 350 point model, unless you were thinking about taking Guilliman anyway. The extra movement is certainly helpful, and it can certainly help you position optimally. Don't forget that because he is within 12 inches of himself, he will always get the +1 to advance and charge. The +1 to advance and charge can also help with an advancing gun line when you're using intercessors or aggressors, as Ultramarines often will want to. Particularly helpful on a unit like aggressors, who will often be advancing before shooting. The morale benefit is nice to have. It's not going to come up too often, to be honest, unless you're leading a bunch of guardsmen into the fray, but it's certainly worth keeping in the back of your mind. Finally, he has the 13th Primarch special rule, which is his rerolls for buffing Ultramarines. You can reroll hit rolls for any friendly Ultramarines within 6 inches of him, and also reroll wound rolls of 1 for them. So this does have the new wording, which means that it will not mind about modifiers. You can just reroll any hit rolls. So his buff package is like being a chapter master and a lieutenant rolled into one. So overall, Roboute Guilliman is one of the more complicated characters in 40k. He has an absolutely devastating melee profile, and also provides very significant buffs to all of his friendly units around him. He's going to want to be with a lot of units to buff, and also to be marching forwards to get into close combat, as it would certainly be a shame to waste all of those fancy melee rules. Let's take a look at some of the buffs and synergies that we can use with him. So firstly, let's mention the Ultramarines chapter tactics. He'll get these if you include him as part of a Supreme Command attachment, but not if he's an auxiliary Lord of War choice. Falling back and shooting isn't terrible on him, but the vast majority of the time I suspect that you're going to be wanting to keep him in close combat, as he'll do far more damage with his melee weapon compared with his shooting attack. To be honest, I don't necessarily see it as the biggest deal to make sure he has the chapter tactic. He'll work just fine in an auxiliary Lord of War detachment. Secondly, we've already talked about his warlord trait, Nobility Made Manifest. I wouldn't get too hung up on the actual trait itself. The best bit about making him your warlord is the 3 extra command points, which are a very valuable addition to the army. In terms of character support, there's a few useful characters that could help him out. In particular, a librarian for Might of Heroes could certainly be very profitable. +1 toughness, attack and strength really will take him to the next level. In particular, it will really boost the Emperor's Sword, as going from strength 8 to strength 9 is actually quite a big jump. Apothecaries could certainly be worth running alongside Guilliman. He's one of the models that has most points per wound in the entire game, so if you can fix a few of those wounds back up, you'll increase his survivability massively. Another option is to run him alongside Chief Librarian Tigurius. whose -1 to hit penalty for any unit could well be applied to Guilliman, making him even harder to remove if he is going off to charge down enemy threats. Quite a lot of stratagems can be applied to Guilliman, as he's a big tough melee type fighter unit. Honour the Chapter for 3 command points could well be worth it when he's putting out something like 17 wounds on vehicle targets on average. With just a few command points you could potentially buy yourself another dead tank should you want to. Also, only in death when duty ends is another good shout. If he is killed for the second time, then hopefully he can drag down whatever killed him. And as always for Space Marine infantry units, transhuman physiology is also an option, and could be very powerful indeed if you do need Guilliman to survive the turn. The only things that are realistically going to kill him efficiently are heavy anti-tank weapons, and making them wound on a 4 or worse has the potential for being a decent defensive buff, though it does cost 2 command points of course. From the Ultramarines book itself, one of the most useful is fall back and re-engage. If you're stuck in combat fighting some sort of unit that you're not too bothered about killing, you could drop back, shoot with that very nice bolt weapon, and charge back in against the threat that you actually want to kill. Finally, as another potential defensive buff, Guilliman could be accompanied by the Victrix Guard to help tank some wounds for him and keep him alive and fighting for longer. Because the enemy has to work quite so hard to put wounds through on him, if you can bounce them onto some very cheap models that are just next to him, you'll be doing yourself a massive favour survivability wise. So how would I run Guilliman myself on the battlefield? I think to make truly efficient use of him, you do need to make use of both his buffing powers and his melee potential in the same game. Otherwise you may well have just bought yourself a captain or chapter master and a lieutenant if you wanted to buff, or just invested in dedicated melee units if you wanted to fight in close combat. That's why I've said a few times already that I would usually pair him with something that wants to advance towards the enemy while laying down some decent firepower. Aggressors really are one of the standout units from the Ultramarines Codex due to being able to move and then double fire, so they pair very nicely with Guilliman as both of them can move up towards the enemy laying down some heavy firepower as they do, and when they get there they all have incredibly nice melee profiles to put the smackdown on whichever unfortunates get in their way. I think intercessors would also work very well for this role too, particularly as the bolt rifle intercessors will be able to move 6 inches and still rapid fire at 30 with the Ultramarines tactical doctrine, and they're not adverse to getting mixed up in close combat either. I think behind this initial screen of fairly tough units, you'd want to consider tailing in some range support alongside him, perhaps something like a repulsor executioner, following along and making the most out of those buff bubbles that he puts out. All sorts of things could work well though. Various shooty tanks or dreadnoughts, maybe devastator centurions. A lot of units will benefit a lot from having those very strong rerolls, and provided you can keep them safe behind a screen of aggressive infantry, it doesn't matter too much if they do make their way up the board more than they would normally. You can certainly combo this buff bubble with a bunch of other Ultramarines characters. I could certainly see myself using a company ancient to fire my guns when they die, a librarian or Tigurius to buff the units nearby, apothecaries to heal Guilliman, chaplains for all of their nice listeners, and perhaps some Victrix Guard to protect them all as well. You can really go as heavy or light on this strategy as you want to. Just remember, with all of these fancy characters you will be spending less points on actual damage dealing high durability units, so there is going to come a point where you might be over investing in the units that you're buffing. In an actual game I'd want to set him up fairly close to the edge of the deployment zone behind this screen, and move up towards the enemy, laying down some heavy firepower as we go. If and when any enemy units get within charge range, I'd certainly think about taking the fight to them. Against a lot of armies, Guilliman isn't going to be the sort of thing that's just removed lightly, so you don't necessarily have to be quite as careful about keeping him screened compared with some characters, as he is ridiculously tough all by himself, plus has the opportunity to get back up. There really isn't much that Guilliman can't handle himself in melee, particularly when you have the option to fight twice for 3 command points, so my advice would be to make what charges you can and make sure he makes an impact. Usually when Guilliman style lists lose a game, it will generally be because all of the units around Guilliman have been wiped out and he's just there on his own fighting the rest of the army. However good he is, he's not going to be able to take an entire army by himself, purely because he can't be in a whole load of places at once, so I'd make sure that you commit him and actually make him start destroying units before you get to that stage. By advancing Guilliman up the table, you should hopefully make the opponent cede a lot of the middle of the board, unless they want to be charged by him and a bunch of very angry Ultramarines. so he can be good for pushing the enemy back and making them not want to take central objectives, for example. When he does connect, certainly remember the options of fighting again and also falling back and charging something different. Both of those could potentially swing a game if he does manage to take out an extra important threat or two, so they're well worth keeping in mind. In terms of other possible units that you could consider instead of Guilliman, the most obvious is Marneus Calgar. He offers some very similar benefits, including being a fighty character who is also very good at buffing the units around him, being very hard to kill, and giving you command points if you make him your warlord. He is nowhere near the same level in melee as Guilliman, but you probably expect that as he's 200 points and Guilliman is 350. I do think both of them are fairly well balanced. You do get a proportionate amount more for Guilliman with the additional points that you'll spend on him, but then Marneus is cheaper, means that you can include other units in your army, and also is an HQ choice, which does make him quite a lot easier to fit into an army. I almost certainly wouldn't take both of these, as I think that you'd be over-investing in high-quality buffs for your Space Marine army. I'd just take one or the other. So overall, I think that Guilliman is a decently competitive centerpiece unit that you will have to build the rest of your army around. But if you manage to get all of his buffs off and then deliver him to close combat to finish the job, he can certainly do a lot for your army. Let me know your thoughts and opinions on him down in the comments below, and please correct me if there's any rules misunderstandings I've made in this video. Feel free to subscribe if you'd like to hear more videos like this. I'll certainly be trying to cover more of the Space Marine characters as we go through. They're very much all on the list, and I'll try and get round to them as soon as I can. Thanks very much for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.